All right. Imagine uncovering hidden value deep in the ground. We're talking potentially eye-popping resources,
hmm
but finding them, that's just the start.
Yeah, unlocking them is where the real challenge lies. And that leads us straight to Seabridge Gold.
Exactly. And their huge KSM project up in British Columbia, Canada.
That's the one. We've been going through a lot of their material,
Yeah.
technical reports, presentations, studies.
Right. And our goal here for you listening is really to distill it all down. We want to give you a clear, quick picture of Seabridge, the estimated scale of KSM, its resources.
What their plan is, how the financials look based on their studies, and, the market context they're seeing this all in, according to these documents.
Think of it as the quick version, hitting the key highlights, the big numbers, the costs, the uncertainties too, without getting totally lost in the technical weeds.
Okay, let's jump in. So Seabridge Gold, the company itself, their focus seems pretty clear from the materials.
Yeah, KSM is definitely the main event. Their core asset.
Right, and it's located, as you said, in British Columbia, Northwest BC specifically. The materials show it near Highway 37.
Okay, so there's some infrastructure nearby.
Yeah, relatively speaking, you've got Highway 37, access via airports like Smithers or Northwest Regionals mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
potential links to ports like Stewart or Prince Rupert too via road and rail.
And crucially,
Crucially, it's near the BC Hydro Northern Transmission Line. That's a big deal for power.
got it. So accessible relatively in a known mineral area. And KSM isn't just one deposit, is it?
No, not at all. It's actually a complex of several distinct mineralized zones they've identified.
Like,
Well, the main ones mentioned are Kerr, Sulphurettes, Mitchell, East Mitchell, and Iron Cap. Each one sort of adds to the overall resource picture.
okay, now let's talk about those eye-popping resources
Yeah.
because the estimated size, it's pretty wild when you look at the dimensions they've outlined from drilling.
The scale is genuinely hard to get your head around sometimes. Take Iron Cap, for example.
Haha.
Based on their drilling interpretation, they estimate it stretches roughly 1,500 meters northeast-southwest.
It's kilometer and a half.
Yeah, and about the same, 1,500 meters northwest-southeast. And it's thick, too, about 850 meters vertically.
Wow. Okay, that's just one zone. A block over a kilometer square and nearly a kilometer deep. What about Kerr? I heard that was even larger in one dimension.
It is, yeah. Kerr's estimated dimensions are roughly 2,400 meters north-south. It's almost 2.5 kilometers.
2.5 Ks.
About 800 meters east-west, and then vertically. It extends down a potential 2,200 meters
2.2 kilometers dip.
deep. Yeah.
Mhm.
So these aren't, small surface things. They're describing potentially massive three-dimensional bodies of mineralized rock.
Okay, hold on. 2.5 Ks long, over 2 Ks deep. The scale is just immense. But you keep saying estimated, and the source materials really hammer this point home. What's the crucial thing for listeners here?
This is absolutely critical. These numbers, these massive figures, they aren't proven facts. They're not guarantees. They are geological estimates.
Okay, based on what?
Based on interpreting the data they get from drilling holes and analyzing the samples, it's essentially projecting outwards from those limited data points across these huge areas.
So like drilling a few holes in a giant cake and guessing the total ingredients.
Sort of, yeah, but with, way more complex geology.
Hmm.
And the confidence level varies. The materials point out that a lot of this potential resource, especially in the deeper block cave areas they're looking at for Kerr and Iron Cap, it's predominantly classified as inferred.
Inferred. And that classification means?
It means the drill holes in those specific areas are spaced further apart, say 100 to 200 meters apart, according to the reports.
Oh, okay.
So while there's enough geological evidence to infer that the mineralization is likely there and continuous, the level of certainty is lower than, say, indicated or measured resources, where the drilling is much closer together.
Right. And that ties directly into the big disclaimers we see everywhere in these documents.
Absolutely. It's vital context. The sources explicitly state, and this is important, there can be no assurance these resource figures will turn out to be accurate.
Okay.
And, crucially, no assurance that this mineralization could actually be mined or processed profitably. That's the bottom line. These are estimates of potential, not guaranteed mineable assets.
Understood. Huge estimated potential, but significant parts are inferred, less certain, and there's no guarantee of economic viability. Got it. What metals are they actually finding in these zones?
The studies show it's primarily gold and copper, but also silver and molybdenum. It's a polymetallic deposit, which is pretty typical for these kinds of porphyry systems.
Gold, copper, silver, moly. Okay, so company, location, huge estimated resources, big uncertainties. What's the plan then? What's Seabridge's strategy, according to the sources, to actually move this forward?
Well, their focus, as laid out in the materials, is squarely on advancing KSM towards potential development.
Yeah.
A big part of that is doing detailed technical studies.
Right, like the ones we looked at.
Exactly. They completed a 2022 pre-feasibility study, a PFS, that looked at one specific mine plan scenario.
Okay.
But they also did a 2022 preliminary economic assessment, a PEA.
Hmm.
And it's important to understand the difference.
How so? The PEA isn't just an update.
No, the materials clarify it's not. The PEA actually looks at a different scenario, a potential future expansion of the mine plan envisioned in the PFS, and it uses different resource estimates as part of that assessment.
Oh, okay. So they're exploring multiple potential scales or phases for KSM. What's the immediate next step recommended in these studies?
The key thing mentioned right now is completing the data collection needed to support a full feasibility study in FS.
Feasibility study. That's the big one before you can really finance and build, right?
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
And FS provides the highest level of confidence in the technical and economic aspects of a project. It's usually what banks and investors need to see before committing major capital for construction.
And does getting data for an FS tie back to those inferred resources we talked about?
Absolutely. Part of that data collection mentioned is the possibility of doing more drilling, specifically infill drilling on the Kerr and Iron Cap deposits.
Infill meaning drilling between the existing holes.
Exactly. To tighten up that spacing, get more sample points, the goal would be to potentially upgrade the resource classification, move some of that inferred material into the higher confidence indicated or maybe even measured categories.
Which would strengthen the basis for an FS and potentially define reserves.
Precisely. Reserves are the portion of measured and indicated resources that are demonstrated to be economically mineable under current conditions and assumptions. That's a key step.
Okay, so they're working on the studies, aiming for an FS, possibly doing more drilling. What about actual stuff on the ground? Are they building anything yet based on the plans?
Yes, the plans described involve major infrastructure. It's not just paper studies.
Yeah.
A huge piece mentioned is the Mitchell Treaty Twin Tunnels, the MTT.
Tunnels.
Yeah, twin tunnels, potentially up to 22 kilometers long, designed for autonomous electric trains.
Wow. To do what?
To transport the ore from the Mitchell deposit area over to where the processing facilities would be located.
Okay, that's massive. What else?
They also describe needing crushing facilities, naturally, and very significantly connecting the whole thing to that BC hydropower line via new substations. Powering something this size is a huge undertaking.
Makes sense. You'd need enormous amounts of electricity.
Right. They even mention systems for managing peak power demand for the really big equipment. So yes, serious infrastructure planning and, in some cases, early works are part of the picture.
Okay, so this project, the scope is just enormous, which inevitably brings us to the money. What kind of costs are we talking about based on their studies?
We are talking very large numbers. The 2022 PEA, remember, that's the potential expansion case study. It gives an estimated total capital cost. That includes the initial build plus all the capital needed over the mine's life.
And the number is?
U.S. $14.252 billion.
14 billion with a B. Okay, that's substantial.
That's definitely substantial, yes.
And what about the cost just to run the thing day to day, year to year? Operating costs.
The studies estimate those too, yeah.
Huh.
Things like mining, processing, admin, site services. They usually break it down into an average cost per ton of ore processed over the life of the mine, or LOM.
Right. So massive investment. What about the potential return? What do the studies project?
Well, again, looking at that 2022 PEA, it projects potential financial outcomes based on its specific assumptions. Things like what they think metal prices will be, the exchange rate, etc.
And the key metrics.
They present figures like net present value, or NPV, and the internal rate of return, IRR. For instance, the base case in that PEA, using a 5% discount rate, showed an estimated NPV of US $13.454 billion.
Okay, so roughly matching the huge estimated capital cost with a huge estimated potential return under those base assumptions.
Estimated, yes. And that's why the sensitivity analysis in these reports is so incredibly important to look at. You can't just take that base NPV number in isolation.
Why not? What does the sensitivity analysis show?
It shows just how much those potential financial results could swing based on changes in key factors.
Like metal prices.
Exactly. Gold price, copper price, silver, molybdenum. But also the U.S.-Canada exchange rate, changes in the capital costs themselves, or the operating costs.
So if gold goes up or down, or construction costs more than planned.
It significantly impacts the estimated NPV and IRR. The analysis makes it crystal clear that the project's potential economics are highly sensitive to these external market factors and internal cost control, projected way out into the future.
Which makes sense for something this big and long term. Did the reports mention the local tax situation?
Briefly, yes.
Yeah.
They note the BC mineral tax regime. It involves a 2% tax on net current proceeds and a 13% tax on net profits. That's part of the financial landscape they'd be operating in.
Okay. Scale, strategy, estimated financials, sensitivities. The sources also seem to frame this whole endeavor within a wider view of the metals market, especially gold.
They do, yeah. There's commentary attributed to the chairman and CEO, Rudy Fronk, talking about the case for gold and discussing topics like the gold market, catching up to paper supply, and the idea of a gold market reset.
So, the company's view presented in the materials is that the long-term outlook for metals, particularly gold, supports taking a project of this scale.
That seems to be the context they're presenting, yes. That they see a favorable backdrop for advancing KSM.
Given that context, what potential future milestones or catalysts are mentioned in the sources that people watching Seabridge might look out for?
Several potential things stand out. Finishing the data collection needed for that feasibility study would be a major step.
Makes sense.
Any news about infill drilling, successfully upgrading resource classifications, moving inferred to, indicated, for example, that would likely be seen as positive, de-risking the resource somewhat.
And on the physical side?
Hitting construction milestones for key infrastructure.
Okay.
Things like the access roads, making progress on those huge Mitchell Treaty tunnels, securing the final power connection agreements. Those would all signal tangible progress.
Any specific dates coming up where we might hear more?
The materials did mention a couple of upcoming events. There's a virtual conference noted for June 11th, 2025, and their annual general meeting scheduled for June 25th, 2025. Those could be opportunities for updates.
Okay. So it's clear this is a project of genuinely massive estimated potential. But we've also touched on the flip side. The immense scale and complexity bring equally significant risks and challenges. What are the absolute key risks highlighted in the materials that listeners must keep in mind?
It really comes back to those disclaimers we discussed. They are front and center in the risk sections. First, resource and reserve figures are estimates. They depend on interpretation, on assumptions, and there's just no guarantee they'll be accurate.
Yeah.
And even if the metals are there, there's no assurance they can be mined or processed profitably. That's fundamental.
And the estimates themselves could change over time.
Definitely. The reports warn that estimates might need adjustments, maybe even downwards, as more work is done or if mining actually begins. What they find when they actually mine might have a different grade than the drill holes suggested.
Yep.
And the recovery rates they get in lab tests might not be perfectly duplicated on a massive industrial scale.
So potential variation in the geology and metallurgy. What about costs and prices?
Huge risk factor.
Yeah.
The financial projections rely on assumed future prices and costs that could easily turn out wrong over decades. Inflation is specifically called out as a risk to capital and operating costs.
And the worry is metal prices might not rise enough to offset higher costs.
That's the uncertainty, yes. Any significant negative change, lower resource estimates, lower grades, lower recoveries, higher costs, lower metal prices could seriously impact the project's viability and the company's finances.
Any other major risk categories mentioned?
Yes, they also mentioned potential environmental issues arising that could impact operations or costs. And it bears repeating that high proportion of inferred resources in key areas like the block caves represents a significant level of geological uncertainty that needs more work to firm up.
Okay, let's try and wrap this deep dive up. We've looked at Seabridge Gold. We've looked at the truly enormous estimated scale of the resources at KSM in BC based on their data.
We've seen their strategy focuses on advancing studies like the PFS and PEA, working towards that crucial feasibility study, gathering more data, and planning or starting major infrastructure like those tunnels.
We also touched on the financial picture from the 2022 PEA, huge estimated capital costs, yes, but also a potentially large estimated NPV. But critically, we saw how sensitive those numbers are to prices and costs, and the uncertainty baked into all these long-term estimates.
Right, and we put in the market context provided the company's bullish view on gold and noted potential catalysts like study completion or drilling results, while really emphasizing the significant risks and cautions from the source material itself.
So, considering that sheer scale of estimated resources at KSM, the complexity, the massive estimated costs, the sensitivity, What does this whole picture perhaps suggest to you about the future challenges, maybe even the necessity, of tackling these kinds of giant, complex deposits to meet future global demand for metals like gold and copper?
Hmm. That's a big question to ponder.
This deep dive is based solely on the provided source material and is for informational purposes only. It does not constitute investment advice, nor does it endorse any particular viewpoint contained within the source material. Resource and financial estimates discussed are inherently uncertain and subject to change.